Just when it seemed like Michigan had its staff finally complete under Sharon Moore, suddenly there's a defection. It was a give some, take some type day on Friday. We are going to discuss the official announcements of the 4 defensive staff as well as the loss of Mike Hart. We're going to do that on this episode of Locked On Wolverines.
You are Locked On Wolverines, your daily podcast on the Michigan Wolverines, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Happy Saturday. We are back and doing it. Locked On Wolverines podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. I am your man on the ground, Isaiah Hole, publisher of Wolverines Wire through USA Today Sports Media Group. And all goes to plan today. This will be a 2-4 day. We will do one here earlier in the day and one later in the day with the mailbag coming. So if you are checking this out earlier and it's pre-7 p.m. on Saturday, get your questions in on Twitter, where I have posed the call for mailbag questions. Nonetheless, it was a hit or miss day in the sense of we got the official announcement finally of the 4 defensive coaches a month late. It took so long to get everything in order. Certainly there has to be a happy medium here because the rush to hiring people before certainly brought some negative headlines sometimes, but the lack of urgency in getting these guys all kind of shored up feels like it was a little too much, right? A literal month from the day that Wink Martindale was brought up as being the hire at defensive coordinator. You get him finally a month later officially announced. That should not take that long. But nonetheless, it seems like everything is in good order there. I do want to remind you, like, even though he did leave the New York Giants, he did not leave the Ravens on bad terms. They just wanted to make some slight schematic changes, slight literally. And then they brought in Mike McDonald. So it's going to be interesting to see what Wink Martindale does when he comes to Ann Arbor, which he is now in Ann Arbor. I mean, I saw him, 3 weeks ago at a basketball game, all donned in, Michigan gear. But at the same time, it'll be interesting to see how he handles. Does he, you see a lot of people saying he's going to run a lot more man. Well, maybe not. Just because that's been what he's done in the past doesn't mean that's what he's going to do now, right? He might take a look at what Michigan's opponents are, what Michigan has as far as player personnel, and say, you know what, the best strategy is to just keep things the same. I can call this, and this is still very much in my wheelhouse, the defense that had been set up under Mike McDonald and Jesse Minter. And I think that's one of those things we'll find out as time goes by, right? Once we start getting to interview players as they've gone through the installs and things of that nature, then we'll be able to find out, okay, how much are you going to do exactly what you were doing before compared to what you're doing now, right? This is not a wholesale change, which is really, really great news. I like the rest of the staff. Now, it is kind of bittersweet because I absolutely adored the entirety of the defensive staff that existed beforehand, from Elston to Jay Harbaugh to Steve Clinkscale. And I'll share a funny Steve Clinkscale story, just because it's just hilarious to me. So Sarah and I were filming, or we were shooting, rather. We weren't filming. We were shooting pictures at the golf outing last year. You can hearken back to that episode. I did one like as a reaction after I got back home that day. And I'm standing there and like talking to someone I don't know, and I felt someone pinch my unfortunately rather sizable love handle. And out of every single person at the golf outing that I would have suspected the least, to turn around and see Steve Clinkscale sitting there smiling, it's just not the person that I would have expected. I would have expected Jim Harbaugh to do it above him. I assumed it was going to be someone like either like a former player that was there, or maybe Sarah. That's not really how Sarah would operate, but I figured it'd be something like that. Maybe someone I knew from the Michigan Alumni Association or something like that. Nope, Steve Klingscale. And he's just sitting there with a big, wide tooth grin. It was just hilarious. So he's a character, and I'm going to miss him dearly. But at the same time, I think that they did a really good job of finding some kind of the perfect, like, okay, if we're going to have to replace some of these guys, then these are the right guys to go with. Greg Scruggs, who's done a really good job kind of climbing the ladder, having a little time in the NFL, and all of that. And then obviously being lured back to college by Luke Fickell. And obviously he did a really good job with Cincinnati in 2021, all of that. So I think that he's a young guy. I'm curious to see how he relates to players, right? And obviously he's got a heck of a room to work with. So that's good news as far as that's concerned. Brian Jean-Marie has already been around, did not have a good singular year in Ann Arbor, but no defensive coach or offensive coach really did. But talking to a former Michigan assistant about a month ago, when before Brian Jean-Marie was announced as he was announced just yesterday, but before he was revealed as being the linebackers coach, they said, like, oh, he's a great coach. That's a perfect fit. So that's really exciting that he comes aboard. Then you got LaMar Morgan, who again took a big step down from being a defensive coordinator at his alma mater, decides to be a position coach at Michigan. He's got a pretty good resume, considering like that's not exactly a school where you're really going to thrive. But again, I think the youth movement with the people that they got, Scruggs and Morgan, who are relatively younger, I think that will really help them. And then you've got some elder experience in Brian Jean-Marie and Wink Martindale. So I think that is always a really good thing, to have a little bit of a balance, right? Not just a bunch of, especially because you don't have Jim Harbaugh. You don't have the guy at the top that is like, okay, that guy knows what he's doing for sure. Now you've got a good mix between young and old. I shouldn't say old, but elderly. From little babies coaching the team to the elderly. Okay, that's not what I'm meaning to say. But I like the composition of the staff, but obviously it comes with a price, because Michigan did lose Mike Hart. We'll get into that, what I had heard beforehand, and we will go from there. So let's get to that. Sorry, I'm still laughing at myself for the elderly part, trying to say, oh, they're not old, they're just elderly. We'll get to those things in just a moment. But before we do, passion, drive, and patience, what brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. All right, so sad news, and I mean, it's not devastatingly sad, right? Like, I don't think anyone's going to like literally cry about it, but maybe you will. The favorite son, the all-time rushing leader in terms of yards at the University of Michigan, helped really develop Hassan Haskins, Blake Corum, Donovan Edwards, and that is Mike Hart. He is not going to be returning. His contract had expired. He had been on a leave of absence, which I had told you for a while. Being on a leave of absence, I know there's going to be people say, like, you said that the leave of absence, he was coming back. I never said he was coming back. I just said he was on a leave of absence. That was true. It did stand to reason that he would be back, because there was no announcement or any sort of like, hey, he's gone. And now, as of Friday, that is the case. So it is very, very sad, because he was certainly a fan favorite due to everything that he had done both at the college level and as a coach. And certainly he had machinations on doing something higher and bigger at Michigan. But it was very clear to me, if it wasn't clear to him, that he wasn't going to get that crack to be the head coach. I mean, Jim Harbaugh basically had told you in June last year, whatever day SMSB was, that Sherrone Moore would be the heir apparent, right? That was kind of when we started talking about it. Now, certainly it did seem like Mike Hart was going to get an opportunity to coach somewhere as a head coach. But, I mean, he went to Indiana where he was an assistant head coach and running backs coach there, and he got passed over for the James Madison dude, whatever his name is. Kurt Signetti, I believe his name is. Signetti, I'm not really sure how you pronounce that. But nonetheless, it's sad because you would feel like that would be a good way to continue the continuity, the coaching continuity, because everything else offensively wasn't terribly different, right? Like, yes, you had the offensive coordinator move up to the head coach. You had the quarterback coach move up to the offensive coordinator. You had the tight ends coach move up to the offensive line coach. You brought in a familiar face in Steve Kazula. Granted, he hasn't coached any of the same players that are around, if memory serves. No. And he comes in after being an offensive coordinator at UMass and then becomes the tight ends coach. So it felt like, okay, now you have the running backs coach. It's the only one who doesn't have any movement, but it's still the familiar face. And certainly maybe that played a part in it. Really never got any clarity as to what the leave of absence was. But a big hat tip to Josh Henschke from Maize and Blue Review, who told me about 4 or 5 days ago, say, hey, I think Mike Hart's moving on. I'm hearing rumblings about that, and it seems like that's what's happening. So this wasn't something that completely blindsided us here, but it certainly was not what we thought. I shouldn't say it wasn't what we thought was happening some time ago, because it was certainly in the cards. It was a possibility. It just seemed the longer it went on that the chances were going to be that he was going to return. Nonetheless, that's a blow as far as the development. I guess it depends on who you can go get. It's kind of late in the process, but I mean, we've seen Michigan make really good moves even later in the process when Brian Jean-Marie left kind of late, right? Like they slid over George Hilo into the he was coming in to be, I believe, a safeties coach, and he slid back to the more natural linebackers coach. And then when Mo Linguist, after spring ball, he had a whole spring. After spring ball, he leaves and he goes and becomes the head coach of Buffalo. Now he's at Alabama. But then they go out and get Steve Clinkscale. So it's not as dire of a circumstance when you're trying to go and get assistant coaches. Head coach is probably a different story, right? And I would say the same thing for like what we talked about the other day with ESPN saying that Michigan, will get its starting quarterback from the transfer portal. It's a little late in the game for that. There's really no one, and I think it was Rick Lempert who sent me the an email and kind of mentioned who would be available that's better than kind of who they have. And to me, the question or the answer to that is no one, right? I think it's unless it's like Arch Manning that enters the transfer portal, chances are Michigan's probably going to stand pat. But I digress. Going off a tangent here. Nonetheless, I think that when you look at Mike Hart leaving, it's a loss from a development standpoint. But if they can go and get a voracious recruiter, because that's the one weird kind of thing. Like, yeah, he went out and got Jordan Marshall and then kind of had a little bit of a victory lap after that. But otherwise, he hasn't really gone out and had any big recruiting wins. So again, a credit to EJ Holland for. I didn't even read his column. I didn't even need to, just because I knew what his opinion was going to be. That's EJ Holland of the Wolverine. And we all kind of know Mike Hart has not been the voracious recruiter and probably was the weakest link on the last staff as far as it came to recruiters. So especially because you probably aren't going to get a voracious recruiter in Wink Martindale, you need to kind of bolster everywhere else. Now, Michigan I don't think, had a voracious recruiter, and I keep saying the word voracious, in Jesse Minter either. But I think, in today's college football, you really need as many hands on deck as you can. I'm not saying every single on-field coach needs to be like this absolute ace dynamic guy that can go out there and, reel just about anybody in. And the good news is like we said before, a couple months ago, Sharon Moore is an ace recruiter, and you now have a head coach that is that. Jim Harbaugh was not that. And yes, he did some things that really kind of set the college football world on fire, from the sleepovers and climbing trees. And, 2 of those things happened in one visit to David Long. But he was not necessarily a guy that was out there closing, right? He was no Alec Baldwin and Glengarry Glen Ross. Debated if I was going to say Jack Lemmon. For you younger people, you're probably like, what the heck is he talking about? So I think that and I would imagine with Sharon, he's going to find a guy that's going to be able to do that. Now, certainly, I know he had taken a swing before at DeMarco Murray, and who decided he was going to stand pat. I believe he's still at Oklahoma. I would take a swing again, right? Like they played together. Maybe you sweeten the pot a little bit. Maybe you add a title. That would be the area that I would go to if I was Sharon Moore, because you certainly can take that swing, and you are the defending national champion. So no matter what you kind of have going on, if you're at another school, you can sit there and you can look and say, all right, look, I'm looking at Michigan's running backs room. It's on par with anyone else. I think like maybe on paper, Ohio State's a little tiny bit better because you got Travion and Quinshad Judkins at this point. But sometimes, less is a little bit more. We learned that in 2020 when you were like, how are you going to spread the ball around? Well, guess what? They didn't figure that out. Just because you sometimes more is not better in the running backs room. So I think that's I think that they are in a good spot to be able to lure someone but I think that's one of the bigger things is figuring out the management, and I think figuring out how you can maybe turn Donovan Edwards into that full-on feature back. Because even though he's looked the part from time to time, last year gives you a little bit more pause after 2022 gave you a lot of hope. So I think that will be tantalizing to someone is like, I think that we can use him in a way that is really intriguing. And I think that he could have been more utilized last year, even while he struggled. And then I think you look at Kalel Mullings, you look at the young guys, Cole Cabana and Benjamin Hall. I mean, Alex Orji just gave a vote of confidence to Benjamin Hall on Twitter a couple days ago. You bring in Micah Capana and Jordan Marshall. Tavier Dunlap still exists. So there's a lot to like about the running backs room. And I think that when you look at the offensive line they'll be running behind, I think it's a situation. If you're a young coach, you can look at it and say, that might be my best bet for forward advancement. And if you can recruit and you can bring in maybe a couple, like a 5-star type guy, which Michigan's had a few, right? Derek, not Derek Moore, Derek Green, Ty Isaac. They were 5 stars, but yet they didn't really end up looking like 5 stars. And yet, Blake Corum certainly looked like a 5-star, and he was a 4-star. Donovan Edwards, actually, he is a 5-star according to 24/7 Sports. So I think you can raise the floor a bit. I think Mike Hart did an incredible job at development, and I don't see any reason why that can't continue with a young, smart person, especially with the offensive line that Michigan has, even though there's an insane amount of turnover there. Speaking of the offensive line, let's keep talking about that part of the equation and kind of where that's going to go here. We're going to do that here in just a moment. Now, I have 18 million smart devices in my house. It's just kind of how I exist. But I literally just turned off my Fire TV before I came in here. It's if you like Amazon, you're familiar with Amazon, and you like having a smart TV. I think in today's world, we all have that. We don't have those old tube TVs. The Amazon Fire TV is the way to go. Now, Fire TV is your destination for sports, live games, highlights, in-depth analysis, all that stuff. Fire TV offers an amazing viewing experience with smart TVs, as well as the Fire TV Stick. I believe that's what Sarah has, and she opted for that over the native the native OS in the TV I got her for Christmas. You can plug it into your existing TV, and it provides access to millions of movies and TV episodes, as well as free and live TV. Whether it's opening weekend for baseball or the college basketball tournament, you're going to want to have a Fire TV. So Fire TV recently created Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. And that includes all of us at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. So Fire TV channels let you dive into all of the game analysis, highlights, and more to keep up to date on all of the latest in the world of sports. March Madness, NBA, Major League Baseball, and a heck of a lot more. Not to mention great news, entertainment, gaming, travel, cooking videos as well. You can check out Fire TV channels on Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should trust me on this. So you can learn more by going to amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. I know normally we say, I'm like, yeah, we're going to have some weekend shows, and we don't. And then today we are at least having this one. And then we will have we'll have another one for sure to make up for I wasn't at home a lot this week. So it's kind of hard to sit down in front of a camera when you're just not around. So we will have the mailbag, like I said. If it's before 7 p.m. On Saturday, get your questions in. We'll get that going. Zuri apparently is very excited about the whole ordeal. So the offensive line, we're kind of getting into this space where we're going to do what I say I don't love doing, which is like, oh, let's talk about the linebackers again and just listing off guys. But I still feel like even though the offensive line wasn't quite up to par last year I shouldn't say it wasn't up to par. It was still excellent. It was still among the best in the country. But it wasn't the same as it was the previous 2 years. And yet this was the one that won the one from last year was the one that won the national championship. I feel so bullish on this offensive line. I feel pretty confident it will be the best in the Big Ten yet again. And last year's was the last 2 years. Michigan has found an identity and it's going to continue that rolling. Even though Sharon Moore is not going to be the position coach, I think that just the sharpness of Grant Newsome, and that's his native position. Usually when you see a guy, it's like Sharon moving from tight ends, like the tight ends were good under Sharon, and then he moves to offensive line, a position he played, and suddenly that group ascends. I think it's going to be somewhat similar. Not that it's going to ascend because it's already been good, but I think also having a young guy in Grant Newsome, I covered the Michigan football team when he was still a recruit. Not fully professionally yet, but I was doing it. It was the next year that I became full-time for 24/7 Sports. So it's wild that's, he's the offensive line coach. People are sleeping on Josh Preeb, who I think is going to just really, he's going to be, Michigan gets a transfer every year that really helps out on that offensive line. And he's that guy. I look at Giovanni El Hadi and I say, he would have been a starter for the last 2 years if it just wasn't him sitting behind Trevor Keegan. Jim Harbaugh, before the season last year, was like, we got to find a way to get Andrew Gentry on the field, and they didn't really do it. They were starting to talk about him the same way they were talking about Zach Zinter. Greg Crippen's been biding his time, and now it finally feels like he's going to get it. Raheem Anderson's kind of gotten lost in the shuffle, kind of reverted back to the scout team, but between him and Greg Crippen, they're going to have a center that's going to work out fine. And then you've got just a number of guys that we've just kind of been waiting about, right? Well, you got Miles Hinton returning. You've got a guy like Jeff Percy who's just been waiting his turn and started a game, against Rutgers in 2022. You've got a guy that's a behemoth that has been kind of also biding his time in Tristan Bounds. There's just a ton to like about that unit. And it's kind of similar as to how it's been the last couple of years. You have to field 5, but there's more than 5 guys that can fill those roles, and you'll feel good about it. The funny thing is, I know I'm missing some people. We could talk about a guy like Connor Jones has been kind of biding his time as well the last couple of years. But this is Michigan being what Michigan used to be. Right? I know the last few years we've seen young Trevor Keegan and a young Zach Zinter come in and play in year one. Or even you go 10 years ago, Mason Cole starting as a freshman. Cesar Ruiz and Michael Onwenu getting major time in their first and second years. That's not what the standard has been at Michigan for decades. And it bodes the best for Michigan that you're in a situation where it's like, man, I don't know if that guy's good because we haven't seen him he's been on campus for 4 years, but we haven't seen him yet. That is weirdly, it causes some pessimism to some degree, but that is what Michigan, especially on the offensive line, always was. You didn't usually, something had gone wrong if a second-year player, or sometimes even a third-year player, was coming in and starting on the offensive line. So now you're kind of back to that, where it's like, I don't know how good this guy is because we haven't seen him, right? Even a guy like Andrew Gentry, who's, obviously had his mission for the LDS church. So he was away from the game for a couple of years. He comes back. He's entering his third year in college. And it's still kind of like, well, he kind of feels like a young guy because we haven't seen him. That is where Michigan's going to thrive, is by having that happen at some of these positions, right? Instead of having a second-year guy suddenly being like, okay, yes. Like being able to develop, understand what the standard is, and then come in and being able to execute that standard. So Michigan's in a really good spot with the offensive line. I love Grant Newsome coaching the unit. I mean, he was spoken of like he's going to be a head coach sooner than later. He was groomed for this position, and that's his native position. So I feel like that group is going to continue to ascend. I would not be surprised at all if by the time that we wrap up the 2024 season, if Michigan's not strongly in consideration for the third out of 4 years of the Joe Moore Award. So I'll be really interested to see. But I think they've got the bodies. I think they've got the people who can actually really make that group thrive. I don't feel like you're reverting back to what it was at late Hoke, early Harbaugh, where there were some struggles there. You at least have a really, really good group, and I'm excited about it. All right, we're gonna move on. We have the mailbag that we will be doing again sometime later this weekend, whether it's Saturday night or early on Sunday. Not going to the basketball game due to church on Sunday, so you might get it in somewhere in there, or maybe we'll get it in later this evening. So anyway, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. We will be back soon. Peace.